Hello, class. This is Instructor Bings coming to you from the American Government Quinton headquarters. And today, or right now, I want to just simply go over some important things in Chapter 17. That way we won't have to do that tomorrow, our last session together. Friday, December 6th. And while I'm going to go over some of these things and mention things that are important, I'm not going to necessarily point out the things that I think you need to know for the test, because I'm thinking very strongly, probably about 80% positive, that the final test will be different than the first three tests, but also simpler, I believe easier, that can be done in an hour or less, most likely. I think I've been giving you an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half. So I will let you know tomorrow for sure how the final test is going to be. Chapter 17, I'm going to put up the slides, and the slides here are fairly, the slide presentation here follows very closely the book outline in Chapter 17. You can read that on your own, so I am not going to go through all these slides in detail. They will be available today on the course homepage under Module 4. So I'm just going to hit the highlights, the concepts that I think are important to know as American citizens. This chapter is about foreign policy. And to sum up what our foreign policy is in one phrase: protecting the American way. Generally speaking, this is an overview of our foreign affairs, which foreign affairs is simply one nation's relationships with other countries. Makes sense, doesn't it? But generally speaking, since World War II, so since about 1945, almost 75 years now, our policy, our foreign policy has been expanding because of our involvement, and really, for the most part, our leadership on the global level. This slide just simply gives you the difference between defense policy and foreign policy. The defense policy really focuses on the military aspect. Foreign policy will include the defense, the military side, and these four things right here are on page 507, and they were the four things mentioned on question 1 in the second quiz of Module 4. 4 tools that a country has at its disposal for foreign policy: military power, diplomacy, economic exchange, And then the intelligence gathering, here it's mentioned as security exchanges. This next graph shows it in a very simple way to remember it, using the acronym of DIME: diplomacy, information, military, economy. D-I-M-E, DIME. These are the 4 tools or instruments that a country has for diplomacy, for foreign policy. All right, also on the quiz, there was a question about isolationism, and we were very isolationist for 150 years, and we were following George Washington's advice in his farewell address after his final term as president. Then there were, I'm going to say, small steps that were in between isolationism and internationalism, which we became when it came to foreign policy, we became internationalists after World War II, or during World War II and then afterwards. So some of the steps in between isolationism and internationalism: the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said the United States was going to be the policeman for the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America. We told European countries to stay out of the affairs of all the nations in North and South America. If they interfered, they would have to deal with the United States. So that happened while we were expanding westward across our continent, right? We added Mexico, or we added Texas. Then we went on to exploring the land that we got from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and then continued westward and continued to basically annex land that was owned by Spain or Mexico, which along with Texas would have included New Mexico and Southern California and parts of Arizona. And then, of course, we went up into the Pacific Northwest and basically negotiated to get land in that area from England and France. While we were expanding in our conquest of land, we were also expanding commercially. And in foreign policy, this area, we had some standalone policies called the Good Neighbor Policy, which affected our relationships with Latin America, and then the Open Door Policy with China. So we told European countries, stop coming over here and meddling with the Western Hemisphere, and that left it open for us to move westward and expand our land, but also to strengthen our economic relationships with foreign countries. Some more steps that happened: the Roosevelt Corollary, And a corollary is something that is an appendage, something that is added. And so this is Teddy Roosevelt, not FDR, not Franklin. This is the first Roosevelt, Teddy, the Rough Rider, the Bull Moose Party founder. And this corollary, this was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. And this, while here it said to the European countries, don't come and entangle yourselves with these countries. We are like the policeman. The corollary said that the United States has the right to intervene in any of our neighbors' domestic affairs if they were unable to basically straighten it out themselves. So, for example, let's say Brazil and South America, let's say there were two factions in their government that were vying for control of who would control the government of Brazil, and it was messing with our economic relationships with Brazil. What the Roosevelt corollary would said is we can go to Brazil and intervene in their domestic affairs. So you see the difference there? This is a foreign country from Europe coming and messing. Let's continue to use Brazil. Let's say Spain was trying to control Brazil. That would be a foreign European country meddling with a South American country. Roosevelt's corollary said, if Brazil is having problems within their own nation, which is a domestic problem, domestic is anything within the country, foreign is outside, we can go down there and act like a referee and we can intervene. That's a pretty bold corollary. But we were basically the world superpower at the time. Who's going to stop us, right? Another step that came with President Truman was the Truman Doctrine. And this started to take shape during World War I. And after World War I, when World War II, excuse me. This began to formulate during the end of World War II, and especially after World War II ended. When World War II ended, we had just been a part of a allied powers that included us, Great Britain, and Russia. We were the primary allied powers, along with France and some others. And we were against the evil axis of Germany, Japan, and Italy. So we defeat them, the end of World War II, and now how are basically we entered into the Cold War with Russia, our allies in World War II, but now Russia basically is in a Europe where there's a vacuum. Germany has been defeated. Italy and Japan have been defeated. Japan is devastated because of the nuclear bombs. Germany. And so Russia basically is free to reign supreme in Europe. So this is why Berlin, the city of Berlin in Germany, was divided into four zones, and Germany itself was divided into two countries, East and West Germany. West Germany was a democracy. East Germany was basically controlled by communist Russia. You also had another you also had another communist power in China. And so Truman was concerned that these two dominant communist countries would basically reign in Europe and Asia. A situation came up where the communists were trying to gain control of Greece, and Truman did not want that to happen because he felt like if they took over Greece, then they would try to take over Turkey. And so he came up with a policy called containment. This policy basically was to help free people, free countries, from being taken over by communist countries. So we wanted to contain communism in those main two countries and not let them, basically not let communism leak out and start taking over other countries. A part of the containment belief was what is called the domino theory. Now, Truman was the first one to use the word domino, but it was actually the president after him, Eisenhower, who basically promoted the domino theory. The domino theory was, if one country falls to communism, then the surrounding countries, its neighboring countries, will fall to communism like a row of dominoes. You push one domino over and you watch all the other dominoes fall. So containment was a policy to keep communism from taking over a country, which would then be like a falling domino, and all the surrounding countries would fall. Here it is here too. China was already a communist country. Korea bordered China. Part of Vietnam bordered China, as well as Korea. The fear would be these countries would all eventually fall like dominoes to communism. So we were going to contain communism. This is an illustration of the Vietnam War. First, there was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. China was supporting the North Koreans. We supported the South Koreans. The South Koreans were free, which incidentally, you still have North and South Korea today. North Korea is a dictatorship with Kim Jong-un. South Korea is a democracy. That was 1950 to 1953. 2 to 3 years later, we started sending in military advisors and specialists because the French left Vietnam and left Vietnam open, and Vietnam also split into North and South. The North being communist, the South being free and democratic. So really in the mid to late 1950s is when we got involved in Vietnam. And so here was the fear, starting with Eisenhower and then moving into Kennedy, President Johnson, and then President Nixon. Our involvement with Vietnam was almost exactly 20 years, from 55 to 75. We were trying to stop communism from taking over and then causing these neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, and Bangladesh, from falling like dominoes and becoming communist countries. FYI, I can already tell you that you need to be familiar with the domino theory for the final exam. Read about it on page 508 and 509, all the way through 510, so pages 508 through 510. And you might even find some good websites, not Wikipedia, but look for history.com and read about, just Google the domino theory, find a few good articles on the domino theory. Make yourself familiar with it. Therefore, the containment theory, the containment policy was our policy after World War II. And World War II is when we became we moved from isolationism to an internationalist country. The policy of containment was in place. We were in what was called the Cold War. The Cold War basically is a war where there is no fighting between armies. It's basically an unspoken hostility. And for us, it was the United States and the Soviet Union, USSR, which was a republic in name. That's what the R stands for, USSR. I think it's United Socialist Satellites Republic, something like that. It was made up of about 15 satellite countries. They were basically larger than states. We have 50 states in the United States of America, which is a democratic republic. The USSR was supposedly 15 nation states that were a part of this Soviet republic, the Soviet Union. But it was not really a republic, it was a communist union. So the Cold War, from basically the end of World War II until about 1989, so about 40 years, was primarily between the United States of America and the USSR, which today the bulk of the USSR land is Russia. Russia was the largest member of the USSR. So there was no fighting between us and Russia as far as troops on the battlefield, but there was a understanding that we had nuclear weapons, they had nuclear weapons, And so this is on the bottom of page 516 and top of page 517 in your textbook. Mutually assured destruction, which basically meant, for example, if the Soviet Union were to launch a nuclear attack on us, let's say they were to attack some of our military bases on the East Coast, we had a setup where we had land-based missiles, we had submarine-based missiles, and we had air bombers that could drop nuclear weapons. So you might take out some of our military bases, but you will not take out everything at once. And so you can be assured, right? Assured that if you attack us with nuclear weapons, we will attack you in return, and you will also sustain destruction. So mutually assured destruction. There was a balance of power between the United States and the USSR. When the USSR disbanded and communism fell in 1989 through 1991, we alone became the superpower on the planet. So before this policy in 1990, multilateralism, there was a basically a bipolar structure to global power, and that was the United States and Russia and the USSR. When the USSR disbanded and communism fell in 1989 through 1991, we became the unipolar power, that is the main superpower. George Bush was our president. This is senior George Bush. And in 1990, he championed basically a world global structure called multilateralism, in which multiple countries work together on given issues, whether it's international trade, whether it's world peace, security, the monetary system, and in what made many ultra right-wing people nervous in 1990, Bush called for a new world order. This was immediately tested in the summer of 1990 through the spring of 91 with the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And the multilateralism worked beautifully because we along with some other European countries basically went in and took care of the main fighting in 4 days. But eventually in February of 91, we moved our troops out of Kuwait. And so that was multilateralism was in place until the second George Bush, little George W. Bush, became president in 2000. And of course, in 2001, terrorism struck. Now, there were already some acts of terrorism before 9/11. For example, there was a terrorist attack in New York City in 1995 at the same World Trade Towers, but it was not as extensive. So you already had pockets of terrorism cropping up. But terrorism really took center stage in 2001 with the 9/11 attacks. And Little George basically came up with the Bush Doctrine, which basically said, we will strike any nation before they can attack us if we are uncertain about what they're doing, what they're about. We will strike preemptively. If we felt like we were threatened, we would not wait until we were attacked. We would strike first and strike hard. So basically the preemptive war doctrine, the Bush Doctrine, is a strike first policy. And for all purposes, it was a replace multi with the word uni, U-N-I. It was a unilateralism policy. One nation taking action against another state. Our textbook will mention that we live in a very challenging world today. Warfare is not conventional anymore, like World War I and World War II, where you had troops on the ground and they were fighting to gain territory. Unconventional warfare is something we saw in really in Vietnam, where we did not know who the enemy was. We could not tell the North Vietnam from the South Vietnam at times. The North Vietnamese fighters would use children as suicide bombers. Vietnam was a very hot jungle type of terrain as opposed to the forests and open land of Europe. So it was unconventional warfare. And then with terrorism, you had warfare taking place in desert type of countries like Iraq and Iran. You had terrorists also using children as suicide bombers. You had terrorists who would kill civilians and still do. You had within countries, you had different religious beliefs, ideologies. You had Muslims, Sunni Muslims fighting against Shia Muslims. So we live in a world today where there's a lot of factors that make modern warfare very challenging. But for the most part, we still, I think we could say that the doctrine, the Bush Doctrine, is still in place. Where'd it go? There it is. We are still not going to, we're going to do all that we can to keep another nation from striking us first. And now it depends kind of on our president, how they are going to, if they're going to work with other nations. Obama was more open to working with other nations, having a coalition. I think Trump, on the whole, would be willing to work with other nations, but he's really going to make sure that, I believe, it would benefit our country economically. And that's where we want to end on this chapter 17, is the economic dimension of national security. more specifically, economic diplomacy. This is the process through which countries deal with other countries so that it benefits to the greatest extent, that is, it maximizes our national interests in all areas, including trade, investment, and other economic beneficial exchanges, hopefully where we can have the advantage, and this type of diplomacy is on many different levels or dimensions. Bilateral, one country with another country. We hear a lot today about Trump and China and our economic relationships with China. That would be bilateral. Bi meaning two. Regional. We can think of the NAFTA agreement that was signed into a policy that came into existence under Bush 1 and then especially Clinton, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That was a regional setup. And then multilateral would be like us, China, and then maybe Russia. Or us and Japan and China. Multi is more than two. Here are the tools for foreign policy. You don't need to know them, but two that I'm going to mention are foreign aid and foreign trade. We provide a lot of aid for other countries, especially developing countries. This has been a key feature in our American foreign policy for more than 50 years. And of course, we send the aid to those nations that would be most beneficial to our foreign policy objectives as well as our domestic tranquility. So foreign aid and then foreign trade or international trade, where we make agreements with other countries and we use things like, and we've heard it a lot with Trump, tariffs, mentioned on page 524, which are taxes on goods from foreign countries. We also hear about trade sanctions, where this is something that is especially in the news right now with the impeachment hearings. Did President Trump threaten Ukraine that they would not receive their aid if they did not help us out? So trade sanctions, punishing another nation by imposing trade barriers, embargoes. This is where a group of countries which would prohibit that group from trading with a nation. Probably a good example would be with North Korea. Whenever Kim Jong-un does his nuclear missile testings, a group of countries will put embargoes on them to get their attention financially. So these are issues in foreign policy and how we try to protect our way of life while getting along with other nations. So you can read the rest of those things in your textbook. I will see you all tomorrow for our final class, and I will have it narrowed down to specifically what you'll need to know for the test. But again, know the domino theory. I know that for sure. So this video will be up soon, along with the slides, and we will see you tomorrow. Have a great Thursday afternoon and evening. Bye-bye.